Imagine that you could truly conquer the oldest human fear. We are all going to die. It's an uncomfortable fact, but it's true. And arguably much of the philosophical project since the dawn of time has been learning to deal with this. We have turned to afterlives, to therapists, to spiritualism to make sense of the idea that one day we won't exist. The light of our consciousness will go out. And whereas a minute before there was something that felt, loved, thought and created, there is now nothing. Just an empty shell of what was once us. But one philosopher famously decreed that even if there is no afterlife, we still have nothing to fear from death. He said, "Where I am, death is not, and where death is, I am not." This man was Epicurus, and today we will be discussing his radical argument that, despite all appearances, we need not fear death, because it doesn't do us any harm. Get ready to learn the two different meanings of the word death, why someone might hurt you even when you no longer exist, and that while dying is terrifying, the alternative is much, much worse. Who knows? You might even overcome your most primal fear. Before we get started, I want to personally thank my friend Emma, who wrote a paper on this very topic. Much of this video is based on her research and our conversations about it. I also want to point out that there is a huge literature on this argument, and I'll only be able to touch upon a small portion of it here. But without further ado, let's get started. 1. Death, harm, and non-existence. There are few things we intuitively fear more than death. This makes evolutionary sense. Without a self-preservation instinct, it would be a miracle that the species has survived this long. But while Epicurus recognizes the existence of this fear, he decries it as fundamentally irrational. His argument is surprisingly simple, but its impact is massive. He first argues that in order for something bad to happen to something, that thing must exist. This makes intuitive sense, right? I can be harmed because I exist. If I were to fall over and graze my knee, that would be a bad thing to happen to me because both myself and my knee exist and have been harmed. But it does not make sense to talk about the harm that unicorns undergo, because they don't exist, or at least I assume they don't. And as a result, nothing bad can happen to them. Arguably, nothing can happen to them at all. Next, Epicurus assumes that we cease to exist when we die. This position is almost presupposed by the issue. If there is an afterlife, then death may be something to be feared, inasmuch as it is a change in circumstances. One that might be for the better, but also might be for the worse. But it's not a unique problem. It would be much like the nerves that someone feels before moving to a new town or starting a new job. If death is not the end, then the fear of death is not a special kind of fear, the terror of non-existence, but rather a fear that we're all familiar with, a fear of the unknown. Finally, Epicurus puts these 2 points together and says that since we cease to exist when we die, death cannot harm us. At the very moment it strikes, we can't be hurt by anything at all. He intends this to alleviate much of our fear about death. He views our mortal terror as fundamentally a fear of the harm we suspect death will cause us. We are scared because we think that death will be worse than life. But Epicurus thinks this fails to grasp what death truly is. It is not a state that is better or worse for us than others, because there is no longer any us that can undergo harms or benefits, pleasure or pain. We can put his argument in propositional form as follows. Bear in mind, this is just one way of formulating it. 1. When we are alive, death cannot harm us. 2. In order for something to harm us, we must exist. 3. When we are dead, we no longer exist. Conclusion 1. Death cannot harm us when we are dead. Conclusion 2, whether we are dead or alive, death cannot harm us. So far, so good. But it is the implication of this argument that really shows its impact. That death is nothing to be afraid of. Epicurus claims that one of our fundamental fears is simply irrational. And he is not saying this as some sort of bizarre put-down, but rather to comfort us. He thinks our fears about death are based on false beliefs of what it actually entails. We normally picture death as something harmful that happens to us. Sometimes this is just because the process of dying definitely does happen to us. If I'm stabbed, then that stabbing happens to me, and it's probably going to be quite unpleasant. This is something it is perfectly rational to fear. I am undergoing harm. And since an awful lot of ways of dying are painful, uncomfortable, or disturbing, then it is understandable that we fear death because it comes attached to these really quite harmful experiences. This was even more the case in ancient Greece than it was now. We may also fail to grasp the true nature of death simply because we can't imagine non-existence. You can try this now. Imagine not being aware of anything anymore. It is impossible because the moment you try to do it, you reaffirm your awareness as an imaginer. So while many of us believe that we will cease to exist at the end of our lives, we can't picture it in a way that allows this reality to fully sink in. This means it's very difficult to conceptualize death as non-existence, and so we think of ourselves as floating through darkness for all eternity, and this thought is genuinely terrifying. But Epicurus thinks that once we dispel these myths about death, we will be left with a picture that's actually very difficult to fear. After all, we did not exist long before our births, and that didn't bother us one bit. So we have good reason to expect that non-existence is not the least bit unpleasant or pleasant or anything at all. It is a wonderfully elegant argument, and it's easy to see how it's gained such historical acclaim. But as you can imagine, there are some serious objections that Epicurus must contend with, and that is just what we shall move on to next. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then consider subscribing to my email list or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. Deprived of life. This sounds like a really weird question, but why does it seem sadder when a 12-year-old dies than when an 80-year-old dies? After all, most people think that all lives are equally valuable. We would not dream of giving 12-year-olds additional rights that we wouldn't grant to octogenarians. And yet, when push comes to shove, most of us would save the life of a child over that of someone very, very old. In the UK, a child's untimely death sometimes makes national news, where there is no such reaction for the elderly. I would wager that most people would answer this question by saying, well, the child had their whole life ahead of them. That's what makes this so tragic. And intuitively, this seems like a pretty satisfactory explanation. If the child had survived their cause of death, they might have lived for another 60 or 70 years. Whereas if the 80-year-old had survived, they would go on to live for far less time. What seems to make the child's death more distressing is that they have been deprived of more potential life than the elderly person. And a philosophy of suffering called deprivationism helps explain this intuition, and will possibly revive our fear of death. For the deprivationist, the thing that makes dying bad is that we are missing out on all of the life we could have had if we were only still alive. That is, if I were to die tomorrow, I would lose all of the experiences I might have over the next few decades. The harm done to me is the deprivation of all of that extra life. In slightly more technical terms, the deprivationist looks at the possible world most similar to our own, but where I live, and says I'm suffering from the loss of all of that potential experience. In some ways, this account has many strengths. It explains why the deaths of children might be sadder than the deaths of the very elderly, and it facilitates other intuitions that seem just as strong. When someone passes away after a long struggle with a protracted, painful illness, we often say that they have been relieved of their suffering. And the deprivationist helps explain why this might comfort any remaining loved ones. Just as if I died tomorrow, I would be deprived of all of the potential pleasure I could experience over the rest of my life. Someone living in constant torment with few upsides will be relieved of all of the potential suffering they would have had if they were to survive longer. The deprivationist position also provides a counterpoint to Epicurus's argument. They concede that Epicurus is right in some ways. Being dead is not an unpleasant experience, and no one who is dead is going to suffer from the very state of death. But they deny that this means no harm is occurring. We are harmed because we are worse off than the version of ourselves that survived for a little bit longer, and much, much worse off than a potentially immortal version of ourselves. This also goes some way to explaining our fear of death. We fear death because we want more life, and I am personally sympathetic to parts of this argument. When I reflect on what makes me scared of non-existence, it's not necessarily the idea of just being dead, but rather because being dead would stop me from doing so many things I want to do. It would stop me from reading or writing or chatting to my friends or drinking tea. Sure, it would stop me suffering, but it would also stop me full stop, with all of the potential activities I could do or experiences I could have. When I think of death, I suffer from FOMO on the existential level, and the deprivationist helps explain why. According to them, I'm not so much scared of death as I am hungry for more life, and I fear that this desire will not be fulfilled. Perhaps selfishly, I also quite like this framing. Fearing death is often painted as the mark of a coward or the weak-minded, but here it stems from loving life. It gives humanity as a whole a little bit more credit for their terror at non-existence. So, there we go. Epicurus refuted, problem solved. We can all go back to fearing death and getting on with our lives. It is perfectly rational to fear death because death would deprive us of something that we deeply desire. More life. If we were to tire of living, then we would no longer fear dying. According to the deprivationist, Epicurus just has things backwards. He is asking whether being dead is an unpleasant state in the first person, and concludes that it is not. But this is not doing justice to all of the ways death could be worthy of fear, even if there is no experience of being dead. But, unsurprisingly, it is much more complicated than this. There are numerous issues with the deprivationist position, and ultimately it's unclear whether it challenges Epicurus at all. And this is just what we're about to discuss. 3. The Malcontents of Deprivationism. Is there not something a little bit strange about the deprivationist's argument? It accounts for some of our intuitions about harm, especially those around death, but it seems much more questionable if we apply it more widely. For instance, if I were to get up from my desk, trip, fall, and bang my head, would that really be harmful because I'm being deprived of a world where I didn't do that? Every time I don't win the lottery, am I being harmed because I am deprived of winning the lottery? While there are potential solutions to these examples, they challenge deprivationism's definition of harm, and allow Epicurus to argue that in many important ways, death still does not harm us. But, as the great Greek himself is no longer with us, we're going to have to craft his response for ourselves. First, we could doubt that the deprivationist has actually explained our fear of death. After all, if it were not just the case that I was going to die tomorrow in this world, but also in every other possible world, would that really allay my fear? Or would the concept of passing away seem just as terrifying, despite the fact I know that there is no possible world where I am better off? I'm not sure about you, but I reckon that I would still fear death under these circumstances, and that any facts about what would happen in other possible realities would do nothing to comfort me in my final hours. So there are some questions about whether the deprivationist fully explains our fear of death. It seems that there is something else that we might be scared of, over and above simply wanting more life. We can also question the type of harm that deprivationism talks about. For this, we will need to borrow a common distinction in philosophy between intrinsic and extrinsic properties. To simplify things somewhat, intrinsic properties are those that are non-relational. That is, they belong to an object in itself. For example, an intrinsic property of mine is that I have curly hair. If I popped into an empty universe with only me in it, I would still have curly hair. But extrinsic properties are relational. One of my extrinsic properties right now is sitting in front of my desk. You could remove my desk and I would lose this property, without anything intuitively changing about me. And this distinction lets us illuminate an important caveat to the deprivationist position. It seems that the harm they think death has is not intrinsic, but extrinsic. It is not that we are going through a harmful experience, one that would still be harmful even if we were the only things to exist, but there is rather an extrinsic harm being done. We are worse off than if we hadn't died. If I die tomorrow, it's simply that I'm worse off than if I didn't die tomorrow. Provided that we have relatively pleasant lives, the total amount of happiness we would experience if we lived an extra 20 years is going to be higher than if we died now. But in some ways, this seems to be very different to the sort of harm that Epicurus is talking about. In his letter to Meneusius, where we find Epicurus's original formulation, the argument is clearly framed around awareness and around the direct experience of suffering. That is intrinsic harm. In his own words, accustom yourself to believing that death is nothing to us, for good and evil imply awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness. As far as I can see, it's pretty clear that Epicurus argues that death is not intrinsically harmful, and infers from that we shouldn't fear it. Whereas the deprivationist argues that death is extrinsically harmful, and as a result our fear is vindicated. That is, the deprivationist argues that we can be harmed by death even when we no longer exist. And perhaps it's worth drawing a distinction here between dying and being dead. Dying is an event, it's the moment of death, whereas being dead is a state, the state we immediately inhabit post-dying. Thank you again to Emma for this observation. It is entirely possible that the deprivationist is right that the event of dying is extrinsically harmful because it deprives us of all the possible life that we would have had, and that Epicurus is also right because the state of being dead is not intrinsically harmful, because we cannot experience anything, and as a result cannot experience any harm. In other words, we can accept both that dying often makes us worse off, and that being dead is not intrinsically harmful. To again take the example of me passing away tomorrow. Here we can both say that once I am dead I can undergo no more intrinsic harm, but also that in dying I'm extrinsically worse off than if I had been alive. So it is rational that I prefer to live past tomorrow, since I desire all of the extra life I will get to experience. Yet it also becomes rational not to fear the state of being dead, because I won't experience any harm if I'm non-existent. On this picture, the Epicurean and the deprivationist actually play quite nicely together. It becomes very reasonable to fear death, but only in the way that you would fear any desire being thwarted. One of my students recently applied for university, and she feared that she wouldn't get a place at her top choice. This is not because she thought she would undergo a great intrinsic harm by not attending this university, but because she wanted something and was afraid that she would not get it. We can perceive our fear of death like this. We don't get what we want, which is more life. And this is understandably frightening and disappointing. But at the same time, Epicurus provides us with some much needed comfort. The experience of being dead will not be unpleasant. And so from that angle, we have nothing to fear. I think this preserves both Epicurus's insight that non-existence can't be a bad state, but it does not mean that we need to be totally indifferent to whether we live or die. We can not want to die as a consequence of wanting to live, rather than fearing death directly. Of course, there are criticisms of this position as well, but I think it captures the strengths of both Epicurus and the deprivationist. But there is one final consideration I want to throw into this debate, and that is the question of immortality. 4. Death, blessing or curse? Imagine I gave you a pill that made you immortal. Never more would you have to fear death's shade. You could live forever, and nothing could kill you. In some ways, this is very tempting. You could do so much more, experience everything you ever wanted, and craft yourself into exactly who you desire to be, without any thought for how long it would take or the efforts needed to achieve it. There are undoubtedly upsides to immortality, but is it really all it's cracked up to be? Many people have argued that far from being the ultimate blessing, immortality would be a terrible curse. Most famously, Bernard Williams argued that any immortal life would eventually become unfulfilling, as we would come to lose all of the desires that give our lives meaning. This is best illustrated by imagining what it would actually be like to be immortal. According to Williams, we all have categorical desires, and these are what make life worth living. These desires are intuitively those that are beyond us. They do not rely on us being alive to see them. Categorical desires are supposed to give us a reason to live because they are the only desires that do not depend on the assumption that we are already alive. Imagine that I only had desires that were of the form, provided that I remain alive, I want to do X. In such a situation, I could fulfill all of my desires immediately by dying, since they are all contingent on the idea that I am still alive. So, according to Williams, categorical desires are those that give me a proper reason for living, and without these, I will inevitably fall into despair. Good examples of categorical desires are things like I want my children to live happy lives, or I want my community to prosper. These desires have no "if I am still alive" clause. They're not conditional on us remaining living. We want them without any reference to whether we exist or not. However, if we are immortal, then Williams thinks that we will eventually lose all of our categorical desires. We will either achieve them or let go of them, or on a long enough time frame, we will achieve every possible categorical desire, and by definition, have nothing left. In a word, we would be dreadfully, eternally bored. There is some intuitive appeal to Williams's argument. Many of us have the sense that while we might want to live very long lives, we would not actually want to live forever, as eventually we would tire of existence. Every moment would bleed into the next, with nothing significant to differentiate them. We would find no reason to go on, or to do anything. We would have seen it all before. No one would be unique or special. Nothing would seem particularly pleasant or unpleasant or new. We would be filled with a crushing indifference to life that would eventually depress us until we yearned for non-existence. Of course, there are arguments against this. Perhaps we can infinitely generate categorical desires. Perhaps we could just take greater and greater quantities of mind-altering substances and live our days in hedonistic bliss. Perhaps we don't even need categorical desires to have meaningful or happy lives. But if Williams is right, then we actually get a very optimistic picture of the problem of mortality, because it makes it actively solvable. If we do not actually desire immortality, then what we want is not to live forever, but just to live long enough. Maybe long enough that all of our categorical desires are satisfied, but maybe just long enough that we're bored of life. And the thing is, this could actually become a reality. According to a study by Gary Sineoff, many elderly people report that their fear of death is pretty low, significantly lower than their children expect them to have. This suggests that our hunger for more life might be lower than we initially thought. It could be that if through medical and technological advances we could raise the average life expectancy to, say, 120 years old, then the overwhelming majority of people would feel little to no thirst for more life at the point that they pass away. Of course, this is just speculation. I have no evidence for a specific figure, but I more want to raise a comforting and tantalizing possibility, even if it is quite remote. We may actually be able to solve the problem of fearing death, or at least fearing death by old age. If we could reasonably expect that by the time we die, we would have no desire for more life, then we would have straightforward empirical reasons to abandon our fear of death. We know that by the time we get there, we won't feel like we're being deprived of anything. And if we agreed with Epicurus that non-existence is not intrinsically harmful, then we would have no fear from this angle either. So there is a potential solution to our anxiety around death that comes not from some great philosophy of life, but rather in a possible future where we know that by the time death is knocking on our door, we will most likely have had our fill of existence and will be more than ready for the embrace of nothingness. How realistic is this? I couldn't possibly say. But let me know what you think. But even if we got over our fear of death, that would not be the end of our existential troubles. So check out this video for how we might cope with the meaninglessness of life. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.